Jamal and I are on the are more activists rather than lawyers. We decided not to come with ties. And maybe that's why they're not broadcasting it.
Not yet.
We've prepared a report. Actually, Emily Schaefer and Michael Svard wrote the report for ICAD, for the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions that I head, on a normative framework, a legal framework for examining the practice of administrative home detentions in East Jerusalem. We call it No Home, No Homeland. And I've given a copy to each member of the jury as a sort of evidence. It's a report on ethnic displacement, and so it's very appropriate being here in the Museum of District 6, because just behind me, if you look here afterwards, there's a whole display on demolition. And this picture, I was going to show it on the PowerPoint if it works, this picture of a pneumatic drill demolishing South African homes, it could be taken right out of the Palestinian context, obviously. And in fact, I think, and I've been asking what I think the term we use for what we do overall, it's not a legal term, is Judaization. We're Judaizing the country. And the term, I think, that was used here, besides forced removals, was relocation. So in a sense, I find a certain symmetry between the idea of Judaization and relocation. And that kind of makes a connection between what I'm going to say and the District 6 story as well. I'm not a lawyer, so, but I do want to say at the very beginning, to kind of position this, that in my view, Israel's 44-year occupation of the Palestinian territories certainly constitutes a crime of apartheid. And CERD, as was mentioned yesterday, has extended the notion or the term, the definition of racial domination to include national and ethnic groups. But another point I want to make is that I think today, less and less, you can separate between Israel proper, if you want to call it that, and the occupied territories. It's a fictional distinction. First of all, Israel itself doesn't make the distinction. You know, Israel officially denies that it has an occupation. So from Israel's point of view, there's no difference between Tel Aviv and what Israelis call Judea and Samaria. And Gaza kind of slips in there. In Hebrew, we say Yesha, which is a pun, which means both salvation, but also Judea, Samaria, and Gaza. So in a sense, Israel sees this as one country. And that, I think, is what gives the idea of apartheid even more meaning, because apartheid is not a policy. It's not a policy of discrimination. You have policies of discrimination everywhere. But it's a system. It's a regime. And in this sense, it's a regime that includes the entire country. And I think Leah's presentation and the presentations of others have shown that inside Israel, the situation of, even though Palestinians may have a formal citizenship, de facto in terms of rights and so on, their situation is really no different in many ways from those of Palestinians in the occupied territories, and certainly the conception of Judaization and of making the country Jewish and of ethnic displacement is common throughout the country. So I'm going to relate to the country as a whole. I'm the head of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, which is an Israeli political and human rights organization that's dedicated to ending the occupation and achieving a just peace between Israelis and Palestinians in whatever form that takes. We believe it's the Palestinians' prerogative to decide what form that takes, and therefore we don't advocate any particular solution. But we use the issue of house demolitions as a vehicle, as kind of a window for letting people understand how the occupation works and what Israel's intentions are. Israel's demolished 26,000 Palestinian homes in the occupied territories only since 1967. But of course, and this policy, if we go back for a minute to the International Convention on the Suppression and Punishment of the Crime of Apartheid, certainly fits into Article 2D, that because the policy of house demolitions is certainly a measure designed to divide the population along racial, or what I would prefer to say, national, ethnic, religious lines. In fact, I want to say this as well, we use the word apartheid in Israel officially. In other words, the word we use, the name of our policy towards the Palestinians is called Hafrada in Hebrew. H-A-F-R-A-D-A. Hafrada in Hebrew means apartheid, a separateness, to separate. We simply say it in Hebrew rather than Afrikaans. But it's the same concept. And in fact, the official name of the wall is not the security barrier, because it really wasn't built for security, but the official name of the wall is the separation barrier. So it's and Israel calls the line of the wall, I was going to show it on a slide, but we don't have it, but Israel calls the tortuous line of the wall that intrudes deeply into Palestinian territory its demographic border. Its security border is the Jordan River. But the demographic border is, and this is all in documents, in government statements. This isn't something secret that I'm revealing today. It's up front and it's explicit, and I think that it conforms to what Leah was saying. And certainly I think also what I'm going to describe with house demolitions relates to Article 2C that deals with denying basic rights and freedoms to the Palestinian people. Now, the practice of house demolitions isn't new, of course. In fact, the British had a policy of house demolitions even during the Mandate period, because it knew that this was one of the most painful ways to deter Palestinians from acts that they didn't want, or to punish the population, because the home is so crucial. I mean, the home is crucial to everyone. It's our most intimate space. You know, the word home is one of those primordial terms. You talk about mother, father, family, and home, hearth. I mean, that's really a part of our language. A human being cannot really function without a home. And therefore, to deprive someone of a home really means to, it's I think, the essence of a policy of displacement. And both on an individual basis and certainly on a collective basis, which is why in we entitled our report, No Home, No Homeland, to connect the individual with the collective. And then, of course, in 1948, Israel certainly adopted a systematic policy of demolitions. In fact, demolitions were not done during the heat of battle. It isn't that the Israeli army came in and was confronted with soldiers from Arab armies or Palestinian fighters, and in the course of fighting, homes were demolished. No. The homes were all demolished. The 572 villages and towns and cities and urban areas that Joseph talked about yesterday were almost all destroyed after the fighting had ceased. In other words, between 1949, actually, and into the 1960s, within Israel proper. And of course, many of these demolitions were done beyond the partition lines of the Jewish state that had been partitioned by the UN in 1947, and in what became Israel. And then we jumped to 1967, and the demolition policies. In fact, the policy of demolishing homes was the first act of the occupation. On June 11th, 1967, the war was beginning to wind down, the 67 war, but it was still in the course of the war. During the night, on the orders of Teddy Kollek, who was later seen as this very liberal mayor of Jerusalem, on his orders, the Israeli army, with no authorization whatsoever, demolished what was called the Mughrabi quarter, a North African quarter where Palestinians had been living for hundreds of years, just in front to make a plaza for the Western Wall. And it happened at night. 350 families were evicted from their homes immediately. And it happened so fast that one elderly woman, a woman named Haja Rasmia Tabaki, was killed in her home during that. And we consider her the first victim of the occupation, because that demolition had nothing whatsoever to do with the war. It was a proactive policy. It began that process of creating facts on the ground. So she was the first victim, and house demolitions was really the first act of occupation. Since that time, Israel's demolished 26,000 homes, as I said, in the occupied territories. And then we come back into Israel, because Israel continues its policy of home demolitions inside the country as well, against Israeli citizens, all of whom are either Palestinians or Bedouins inside Israel, whose homes are demolished. Certainly we know about the demolition of Palestinian homes in Lud and Ramleh and Jaffa, and many times, like in Jaffa, for economic reasons, simply as a part of a gentrification process to displace Arabs from their homes in order that middle-class Jews move in. In fact, Jaffa, which is a part of the Tel Aviv municipality, could really be called a settlement. The National Religious Party, one of the parties in Israel, has a building company. And they're the ones that are building an exclusively Jewish settlement in the center of Jaffa. So that demolitions and displacement inside Israel are very common. And of course, we have to mention what's happening to the Bedouin population of the Negev and elsewhere, where there are some villages that have been destroyed 20 times or more by the Israeli authorities. So the purpose, then, of demolitions is twofold. One is displacement. This Judaization process that's a form of relocation, as you would say in South Africa, but it's certainly ethnic displacement. Even I would go so far as to say ethnic cleansing. And it's both internal and external. In other words, it's external in the sense of trying to drive Palestinians out of the country, either actually driving them out, as happened in 48, and to some degree in 67, including deportations, or to create, and it was mentioned yesterday, matter of fact, it was mentioned today, to create conditions so difficult for Palestinians that you induce a so-called voluntary emigration from the country. And internal, and I was going to show that, maybe I will show that in the slide actually. Internal in that Palestinians are being confined to small little enclaves within the country. Areas A and B being 40% of the West Bank. Gaza, of course, is a closed ghetto. But even inside Israel, where Palestinians are 20% of the Israeli population, they're confined pretty much by law and some of the administrative rules and regulations that Leah and others have mentioned, by confined to about 3.5% of the territory of Israel. And of course, then the other purpose is to divide the territory, what we began talking about, divide both the territory and the population, and that has to do with Hafradah. So, like in South Africa, Israel embeds this policy in law, administration, regulations. It creates a very Kafkaesque system, which I think is the best way to describe it. So that in the occupied territories, for example, Israel, first of all, does not recognize Palestinian deeds of land. There was a process after 1948, when Jordan took the West Bank, of systematically trying to register Palestinian lands in Jordan, in the Jordanian Land Registry Office, which was also resisted by the Palestinians. And they got, until 1967, they'd only gotten about a third of the way down the West Bank to around Nablus. And when Israel took the West Bank in 67, the first thing it did was to stop this policy of registration. So the Israeli policy today is that any lands not registered with Jordan, in other words, lands with Ottoman deeds, lands with British era deeds, Palestinians had their own local system called the Kushan. All those deeds are not recognized unless they're registered with the Jordanian Land Registry Office, and of course there are very few deeds. But if you look at the map, actually, you see there are less settlements in the north of the West Bank than there are in the other two-thirds, partly because of this.
Sorry.
And then Israel relies on British mandate
Sorry,
plans.
Jeff, could you move to wrapping up?
To wrapping up? Okay. Wow, 15 minutes. Time moves fast when you're having fun. All right, let me just say real quick, really in a couple minutes. Israel uses British plans of 1942, what are called RJ5 for Jerusalem, S15 for the West Bank, in which Israel has essentially frozen Palestinian building in 1942 because the British pretty much zoned the entire West Bank as agricultural land. And then that allows Israel to deny Palestinians permits for building houses on land that they own. Even land that Israel recognizes they own, they can't build on because it's zoned as agricultural land in 1942. And in East Jerusalem, all of East Jerusalem has been zoned as open green space. So Palestinians, again, even if they own land, cannot build. So the Palestinians have been restricted to 8% of the urban space of Jerusalem, and on most of that they can't build because it's been built upon already, and within Israel is state lands. So let me just say in conclusion that there are three kinds of demolitions. I was going to explain a little bit more, but it's okay. The first kind of demolition is what everybody thinks about, punitive. Well, what you hear in Israel as well, these people were terrorists, so okay, but that's not true. Security has nothing to do with the policy of house demolitions. The punitive policy of demolishing homes of people accused of being terrorists, you don't have to be convicted, ended in 2005. The Israeli army itself came to the conclusion that it was counterproductive. So you don't have that kind of punitive demolition anymore. The second kind is military, in which houses are demolished as collateral damage or collective punishment in military invasions. So for example, in the invasion of Gaza in 2008, for those 3 weeks, Israel demolished about 8,000 Palestinian homes. They weren't targeted, the only reason was that they were in the way, or of course, it was a form of collective punishment. And the third form of demolition is Israel simply using the administrative and zoning and planning regulations to deny building permits based on what I've talked about before, British plans and so on, so that and denying Palestinians building permits, basically. So that in the West Bank, homes are demolished by the civil administration, whereas in East Jerusalem, homes are demolished by two governmental bodies, the municipality and the Ministry of Interior. So I just want to show, just if I can, just 3 slides real quick. I was supposed to nod. Okay. And then it's just to, not to explain them, but simply to put them on the record and show what I've been saying. It's a process. Okay. Okay. If you want, we can do that during the course of questions, if you'd like to make this shorter. Yeah.
I think that might be better. We have time for 3 questions. Does anybody want to kick off?
Okay.
Ronnie?
All right, but it's not this one. Okay. Okay.
Are you ready to go with your show or for a question?
I'm multitasking.
You can take a question and show your show at the same time, Jack.
Yeah.
It's a simple question. You've given us one figure of 26,000 homes demolished since '67 in the so-called occupied territories, right? Mm-hmm. How many homes would have been demolished within what you call Israel proper. Perhaps, I know if we go back to 48, you're talking about thousands more because of the 500 plus villages destroyed. But can you give an estimate of this at all?
No, we can't. We don't even know exactly how many homes are demolished in the West Bank, or in East Jerusalem for that matter, partly because, you know, the figures are secret or they're not given out. Certainly inside Israel, there's never been a count, as far as I know. Even, you know, when you're demolishing a Palestinian or a Bedouin community in the Negev, they're not even, the Bedouin homes are not even considered homes. They're called structures. So you can't separate between, for example, a cattle pen and a home. And the homes, you know, the homes of the Bedouins are considered by Israel rubbish, so that they're not even demolished as homes. They're demolished as a part of a garbage removal system, which means that you don't even have to go through the processes of issuing demolition orders and letting people go to courts and so on. So we have no idea how many homes have been demolished. And then, of course, you also have the issue on both sides, mainly though in the West Bank, of self-demolitions. Because what I didn't mention was that Palestinians, in addition to getting demolition orders and getting demolished, also many of them get fines. And the fines are heavy. The fines are $15,000 to $20,000. You know, for a family that makes $500 a month and has 7 or 8 kids. And the courts will say to these Palestinians, if you demolish your home yourself, so we don't have to pay for it, we don't have to send police and army, and we'll reduce the fine by half. And we have no idea, because it's not written anywhere, how many people have actually demolished. We estimate that the 26,000 figure is probably 2/3 of the actual figure of homes demolished, but it's simply an estimate.
Stefan?
May I ask you, dear Jeff, what happened to the cemetery of Manila in Jerusalem,
That's right,
which apparently was also demolished and something extraordinary built there? Can you tell us about that?
It's more than extraordinary. It's a kind of a bad joke almost. You know, there's an ancient Muslim cemetery in the center of West Jerusalem called Mamila. It's hundreds of years old. In fact, thousands of Salah ad-Din's warriors, soldiers were buried there, plus, you know, the nobles and dignitaries, not only of the Palestinians, but people, Muslims dying in other parts of the world would often want to be buried in Jerusalem. It was a central burial place right near the old city. And so the State of Israel gave, in Los Angeles, there's a museum called the Museum of Tolerance, which has to do with the Holocaust. It's a Jewish museum, very right-wing, and that museum got land. I mean, in other words, the Israeli municipality that had already built a park, what we call Independence Park, on most of the cemetery. Most of the rest of the cemetery was then given over to the Museum of Tolerance. So there's going to be a Museum of Tolerance built on top of the Muslim cemetery of Mamila. And of course, because there's legal issues and this and that, and there's been resistance, at night what happens is at night the contractors hire Arab kids. They give them cardboard boxes, they give them shovels, the kids don't know what's going on, and they dig up the graves at night, they throw all the bones into the boxes, throw them somewhere, and then the cemetery has de facto been destroyed. Let me just, can I just, 1 second, I just want to show on the map, not to explain again, but this map really indicates this idea of fragmentation and the division of lands. You can see areas A and B, and certainly the red areas are the settlement blocks that Israel wants to keep. Plus, as a whole, it's what I call a matrix of control. It has to do with administrative and military and planning and land use issues. You can also see the whole system that was referred to today of the apartheid road system that's been laid across the territories. This picture of house demolitions, I'm telling you, if you come and look behind me, it's almost the same picture. I mean, it's really amazing. So to make the connection visually, and of course, I didn't get into the whole issue of how traumatic house demolitions are to families. In fact, men, women, and children react very differently. We won't talk about that now. And then the line of the wall that you can see here. And the line of the wall, again, the wall is the separation wall. And you can see very clearly that it surrounds what we call cantons. A canton of Palestinian areas in the northern West Bank, in the central West Bank, and the southern West Bank. And that creates those cantons. That's the word Israel uses. This is Sharon's cantonization plan. And lock them into those cantons. And then, of course, when the wall hits the reddish areas, the settlement blocks, it goes around them to incorporate them. So you can see very clearly, simply by the root of the wall, the separation, apartheid aspect. And finally, this is a map. This is, in a sense, a map of the Bantustan. I mean, Israel is actually going to apartheid.
Yeah.
And
I'm sorry to cut you, but just one final question. What do you think the ultimate motivation is for this policy, and how do you think it relates to the broader policy of territorial fragmentation? But if you could just sum that up quickly.
Well, first of all, I would say one direction is towards apartheid. And this is the Bantustan. I mean, you can, if you take out the settlement blocks, add the root of the wall, take out Jerusalem, you can make a map of the Bantustan. It's not something that's, you have to be a genius to figure out. That's one direction that Israel's going. Ironically, apartheid is the liberal approach in Israel. This is what the Labour Party is advocating. I would say where the Israeli government today is going, the Netanyahu government, is towards not this. Netanyahu would say, why should we give 15% of our country to Arabs? Not to mention the 22% of the two-state solution, the 15% of the Bantustan, it's all ours. And therefore, Israel, the word I would use is warehousing. It's a word coming out of the prison world. It's a term coming out of the prison world. And I think the idea is to simply warehouse Palestinians in these enclaves, let the international community feed them like it does in Gaza, and the world, and they're quietized, pacified, and the world will forget about them.
Thank you very much. Thank you.